The dust was a living thing. It coated Ilara's tongue, gritted between her teeth, and settled in a fine, ochre shroud over the black fabric of her dress. For 3 days, the wagon had rattled across a world bleached of color, a vast, unforgiving expanse of cracked earth and brittle grass under a pitiless sky. The man driving the wagon, a freighter named Gus with a face like cured leather, had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since leaving the relative civilization of dusty redemption. She was cargo. A debt settled. Less than a mule, for a mule had a clear and honest purpose. Her purpose felt shrouded in a shame so profound it was a physical weight on her shoulders. The wagon slowed, its groaning wheels a sound of finality. Ahead, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the encroaching dusk, stood a cabin. It was not a home. It was a scar on the land, a structure of raw, dark timber hunkered low against the incessant wind, its windows like vacant eyes. A curl of smoke, thin and grey, was torn from the stone chimney and shredded instantly by the gale. This was the place. This was her destination. Her cage. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the numb resignation that had been her shield. This was the ranch of Silas Cole. The man who had won her. The words echoed in her mind, a litany of her own worthlessness. Not chosen, not courted, not even purchased in a straightforward, transactional way. Won. Like a pocket watch or a hand of cards. Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. This is it. Cole's place. A figure emerged from the cabin, moving from the square of faint lamplight in the doorway into the deeper gloom of the twilight. He was tall, broader than she had imagined, a shape of substance and shadow. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, no wasted motion, as he approached the wagon. He did not look at her. His attention was on Gus. "You're late." The man's voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice that did not expect a reply and did not receive one. "Roads bad." "Wind's worse," Gus grunted, climbing down from his seat. He untied her small, battered trunk from the back and dropped it to the ground with a thud that seemed to shake her very bones. It contained all she owned in the world. Silas Cole finally lifted his gaze, and Ilara felt it like a physical touch. His eyes, even in the failing light, were pale, stark against a face weathered by sun and wind. They held no warmth, no welcome, but also, strangely, none of the leering triumph she had dreaded. There was only a deep, unnerving stillness, a quiet assessment that took in her worn dress, her tightly clasped hands, the tremor in her chin she could not suppress. He looked at her as he might look at a skittish new horse, judging its temperament, its potential for breaking. Despair washed over her, so potent it threatened to steal the air from her lungs. She had thought herself empty, hollowed out by the journey and the humiliation. But this was a new, deeper abyss. The sheer, desolate loneliness of the landscape was a mirror to her soul. Here, a scream would be swallowed by the wind. A tear would turn to dust before it fell. Gus gestured to her with a thumb. "She's paid in full." Jedediah's marker, settled. My part's done. He climbed back onto his seat, eager to be gone, to leave this bleak place and its silent, brooding master behind. Silas gave a curt nod, his gaze still on Ilara. He seemed to be waiting. For what? For her to speak? To weep? To protest an arrangement she had no power to change? The wagon creaked and groaned as it turned, its retreat a sound of utter abandonment. She was alone with him. The silence stretched, pulled taut by the howling wind. She had to get down. She had to move. Her limbs felt like lead, rooted to the hard wagon bench. He took a single step forward, and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement. His expression did not change, but a muscle feathered in his jaw. He stopped, holding his ground. He would not help her down. He would not force her. He would simply wait. It was a test. The first of how many, she could not guess. Drawing a ragged breath that tasted of dust and desolation, Ilara gathered the worn fabric of her skirt and, with as much dignity as she could muster, climbed down to stand on his land. Her land now, in the most damning of ways. The wind immediately whipped at her, pressing the cold fabric of her dress against her legs, pulling strands of hair from their pins to lash at her face. She stood before him, a piece of flotsam washed up on the shore of his desolate life. He did not offer to take her trunk. He simply turned his back and walked toward the cabin. "The house is there," he said, his words nearly lost to the wind. It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. She was left with a choice: follow him into the suffocating confines of that dark structure, or remain in the vast, crushing emptiness of the plains. They were two different kinds of prisons. She picked up her trunk, the handle biting into her cold fingers, and followed the dark shape of the man who owned her. The door closed behind them, shutting out the wind but trapping a silence that was somehow louder. The room was sparse, brutally functional. A stone hearth where a low fire guttered, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few tin plates. A door stood closed on the far wall. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and solitude. Silas moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting his shadow, huge and distorted, against the wall. He did not look at her. He seemed to have forgotten her presence entirely. The stillness in the cabin was a living thing, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She stood by the door, her trunk a pathetic anchor in this strange, hostile sea. He had won her. He had brought her to this place at the edge of the world. Now what? The question hung in the air between them, unspoken, heavy with dread. Her mind raced, a frantic animal in a cage. Was she to be his wife in truth? His servant? A mere vessel for his needs? The uncertainty was a torment worse than any expected cruelty. "That room," he said at last, his voice startlingly close. He had moved without a sound. He gestured with his chin toward the closed door. "It's yours." Ilara stared, uncomprehending. A room of her own? It was a small mercy, but it felt as vast as the plains outside. She nodded, unable to form words. "There's a cot. A basin. It's clean," he spoke in short, declarative sentences, as if explaining the function of a tool. "You'll be safe in there." Safe. The word was so alien in her current reality that it took a moment to register. Safe from what? From the wind? From the loneliness? Or from him? The implication was clear, and it sent a confusing ripple of something other than fear through her. He was setting a boundary. He was acknowledging, in his own stark way, that she was not just chattel. He turned away, his back to her once more, and began to ladle stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the table, along with a chunk of dark bread. He did not set a place for her. He ate standing, his focus on his food, his posture rigid. He was a man walled up inside himself, the stones of his fortress mortared with silence. She watched him, her fear slowly being overlaid by a cautious curiosity. This was not the brute she had envisioned. The man who gambled for a woman, Jedediah, had been full of swagger and cheap whiskey, his eyes roaming over her with possessive hunger. Silas Cole was nothing like him. There was a severity to him, a profound isolation that seemed to emanate from him like cold from a block of ice. After a moment, she picked up her trunk and carried it to the door he had indicated. It opened with a slight creak into a small, cell-like room. But as he'd said, it was clean. A narrow cot was made with a threadbare but neatly folded blanket. A small washstand held a pitcher and basin. There was even a small, high window, a grey rectangle against the blackness of the night. She set her trunk down and closed the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound of profound finality. Leaning her back against the rough wood, she finally allowed the tears she had held captive for days to fall, silent tracks of grief and confusion in the suffocating darkness of her new life. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the ranch. Ilara rose before dawn, the chill of the cabin floor seeping through the thin soles of her shoes. She would find Silas already gone, the main room empty but for a pot of bitter coffee left warming by the hearth. She learned his routines not through words, but through observation. He worked from before first light until long after dusk, a relentless, punishing schedule that seemed designed to leave no room for thought, for memory, for feeling. He moved across his land with a grim purpose, mending fences that the wind constantly assaulted, tending to his small herd of tough, long-horned cattle, his movements economical and sure. He was a man intimately familiar with hardship, one who met it not with complaint, but with silent, unceasing labor. She, in turn, found her own work. The cabin, scrubbed and swept, began to lose some of its starkness. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat, leaving them folded on his cot while he was out. She learned the quirks of the temperamental wood stove, coaxing it to produce passable bread. She discovered a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cabin, protected from the worst of the wind, and began the arduous task of turning the soil, hoping to coax a few hardy vegetables from the stubborn ground. They were two solitary planets orbiting the same dim star of survival, their paths parallel but never intersecting. Their conversations were shards of language, functional and bare. The well pump is stiff, I need flour, a storm is coming from the west, he would leave a sack of flour on the porch. He would spend an hour dismantling and oiling the pump until it moved smoothly. He would secure the shutters on the cabin before riding out to check on the herd. His care for her was manifest in these small, practical actions, never in a word or a look. He ate the food she prepared without comment, but she noticed he always finished every last bite. He never entered her room. He never so much as brushed against her in the narrow confines of the main cabin. He granted her a space, a physical and emotional distance that was both a relief and a source of profound loneliness. One afternoon, a dust storm blew in, a roiling wall of brown that swallowed the sun and turned the world into a howling, suffocating twilight. Ilara had been outside, trying to secure a loose board on the chicken coop, when it hit. The wind tore the hammer from her grasp and sent it skittering into the gloom. Grit blasted her face, blinding her. Panic seized her as she stumbled, disoriented, the cabin completely obscured from view. Suddenly, a hand clamped around her arm. It was Silas. He had appeared out of the maelstrom, a solid presence in the chaos. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her along, his grip firm but not bruising, shielding her with his own body as they fought their way back to the cabin. Inside, with the door barred and the storm raging against the walls, they stood in the dim light, both covered in a film of dust, the wind screaming like a banshee outside. He released her arm, his gaze falling to a long, shallow scratch on her forearm where a piece of flying debris had caught her. Without a word, he went to the shelf, took down a small tin of salve, and dabbed it gently onto the wound. His touch was unexpectedly careful, his rough fingers surprisingly tender. The moment stretched, intimate and unnerving. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her sleeve, see the deep lines etched around his eyes. For the first time, she saw not just the stoic rancher, but a flicker of something else in their pale depths, a weariness, a hint of a sorrow long held. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his mask of indifference snapping back into place. "Stay inside," he said, his voice gruff, and turned away to stare into the fire, a sentinel at his post, guarding against a world that was always trying to tear his life apart. The trip to the town of redemption was a necessity they could no longer avoid. The pantry was nearly bare, and Silas needed to purchase salt licks for the cattle and a new axe head. The journey was made in the same wagon that had delivered her, but this time she sat beside him on the hard bench seat. The silence between them was different now, less a void and more a shared space, weighted with the unspoken history of the past few weeks. She had proven she would not shatter, and he had proven he was not a monster. It was a fragile foundation, but it was something. As they neared the town, a collection of tired wooden buildings shimmering in the heat, Ilara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Here, she was not just Ilara. She was Silas Cole's woman, the one he'd won off Jedediah Vance in a poker game. The story, she was sure, would have preceded them. Her fears were realized the moment they pulled up to the general store. Faces appeared in windows. Conversations on the boardwalk ceased, replaced by murmurs that followed them like flies. As Silas helped her down from the wagon, a small, stiff gesture of propriety, she felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes. They were a spectacle, the reclusive rancher and his scandalous acquisition. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, cured meats, and silent judgment. The storekeeper, a balding man with shifty eyes, addressed Silas but let his gaze slide constantly to Ilara, a greasy curiosity in his look that made her skin crawl. Women, gathered by the bolts of fabric, fell into a conspiratorial hush, their disapproval a palpable force. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the rough floorboards, feeling a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She was branded. They were both outsiders, he by choice and she by circumstance, and their union had only solidified their pariah status. As Silas was negotiating the price of the axe heads, the store's batwing doors swung open, and a man swaggered in. It was Jedediah Vance. His face was florid, his waistcoat stained, and his eyes held a familiar, arrogant gleam. He saw them immediately, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "If it ain't the happy couple. Enjoying my winnings, Cole." He winked at Ilara, a gesture so vulgar it made her stomach clench. Silas went completely still. His back was to Jedediah, but Ilara saw his hands, resting on the counter, clench into white-knuckled fists. The easygoing posture he'd held was gone, replaced by a dangerous rigidity. "I'm conducting business, Vance," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "Business?" Jedediah laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Seems to me your most valuable asset is standing right over there. Hope you're taking good care of my investment." He took a step toward Ilara, his eyes lingering on her in a way that felt like a physical violation. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt trapped, pinned by his leering gaze and the avid curiosity of the onlookers. This was the moment she had dreaded, the public confirmation of her shame. But then she looked at Silas. He had turned slowly, placing himself between her and Jedediah. His face was a thundercloud, his pale eyes burning with a cold fire she had never seen before. He wasn't looking at Jedediah. He was looking at her, and in that look, she saw not possession, but a fierce, startling protectiveness. He was defending her. Not his property, but her. In that silent, charged moment, the fragile foundation between them settled, hardened into something solid. They were not just two people enduring a situation. They were they, pitted against the cruelties of the world, and of men like Jedediah Vance. Silas moved his head in a barely perceptible motion toward the door. "Wait in the wagon," he said, his voice still low, but now with a steel edge that vibrated through the silent store. Without a second thought, she obeyed, walking past Jedediah with her head held high, feeling Silas's protective presence like a shield at her back. The weeks that followed the confrontation in town were different. The silence on the ranch remained, but its quality had changed. It was no longer a sign of distance, but of comfort. An understanding had been forged in the crucible of public humiliation. They were allies. Ilara found herself working the small garden plot with a new sense of purpose. It was no longer just a way to pass the time, it was a contribution. When she coaxed the first green shoots from the soil, she felt a fierce surge of pride. She was not just surviving here, she was creating something. She was putting down roots, however shallow, in this hard, unyielding land. One evening, she looked up from her weeding to find Silas standing nearby, watching her. He held out his hand. In his calloused palm lay a small, crumpled paper packet. "Pumpkin seeds," he said gruffly. "From the store. They say they grow well here." It was a gift, an acknowledgement of her efforts, and it felt more precious than gold. She began to see the man behind the stoic facade. She saw the way his hands, so capable of force and hard labor, could be gentle as he reset the broken wing of a small bird that had flown into the cabin window. He built a small splint for it from twigs and thread, and kept it in a box by the fire until it was strong enough to fly away. He never spoke of it, but she saw him check on it every morning. She began to understand that his silence was not a lack of feeling, but a shield for feelings that ran too deep for casual expression. He was a man who communicated through action, not words. His protection, his provision, his respect for her space, these were his vocabulary. One night, a late frost threatened her burgeoning garden. She woke to a sudden, biting cold and knew instinctively that the tender young plants would be lost. She threw on a shawl and rushed outside, her heart sinking at the sight of the silvery sheen on the leaves. She began frantically trying to cover the plants with burlap sacks, her fingers growing numb in the frigid air. A lantern bobbed in the darkness. It was Silas. He had brought 2 old, threadbare blankets from the cabin. Together, without a word, they worked in the flickering lantern light, stretching the blankets over the most vulnerable rows, securing them with stones. When they were finished, they stood for a moment in the profound stillness of the cold night. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath pluming in the air. He looked not at her, but at their handiwork, the makeshift tents protecting her small patch of life. "It was a fool's hope, planting a garden here," he said, his voice low and rough with something she couldn't name. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded almost like a confession. "Perhaps," she replied softly, looking at the blankets. "But sometimes a fool's hope is all a person has." He finally turned his head and looked at her, his pale eyes catching the lantern light. "My wife, Sarah," he began, and the name hung in the cold air between them, a ghost suddenly given form. "She tried to plant a garden in this same spot." "Roses," he gave a short, harsh sigh that was almost a laugh. "Roses." In this devil's dirt he paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. The first winter took them. The second winter. It took her. The confession was stark, brutal, and it explained everything: the isolation, the fortress of silence, the profound sorrow that clung to him like the dust of the plains. He was not just a man alone, he was a man haunted. He had built this life not out of misanthropy, but out of a grief so vast it had swallowed his world. In that moment, seeing the raw pain he had kept hidden for so long, Ilara's heart ached for him. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a second before she laid her hand gently on his arm. He flinched, but did not pull away. The touch was a small anchor in the vast sea of his loss, a silent acknowledgement that she had heard him, that she understood. The fragile piece of their existence was destined to be shattered. Jedediah Vance was not a man to accept public humiliation. His pride, fueled by whiskey and a festering resentment, demanded satisfaction. Rumors began to drift back to them, carried by the occasional passing trapper. Vance was telling anyone who would listen that Cole had stolen his property, that the woman was his by right, and that he intended to reclaim what was his. The threats were no longer veiled. They were a promise. The knowledge settled over the small ranch like a shroud, a constant, low-grade tension that vibrated in the air. Silas became even more withdrawn, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand rarely straying far from the rifle that now leaned permanently by the door. He was a man bracing for a storm he knew was coming. Ilara felt the fear, a cold knot in her gut, but it was different now. It was not the helpless terror of her arrival. This was her home. That small patch of earth with its struggling vegetables was hers. The clean-scrubbed floorboards, the warmth of the hearth, the quiet rhythm of their days, she had helped build this life from the ruins of her old one. She would not let a man like Jedediah Vance destroy it. Her fear was mingled with a fierce, protective anger. She watched Silas, saw the weight of the coming conflict pressing down on him, aging him before her eyes. He was preparing to fight this battle alone, to shield her as he always did. But she was no longer the fragile cargo he had received. She was his partner, whether he had acknowledged it in words or not. She had to make him see that. She had to make everyone see it. The opportunity came on a Sunday. Silas rarely went to town, but he needed a part for the water pump that couldn't wait. As they prepared to leave, Ilara did something different. She did not wear her plain, dark dress. She put on the one good dress she owned, a deep blue calico she had sewn herself. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up with care. She was not dressing for herself, or for him. She was dressing for battle. When she emerged from her room, Silas stopped, his hand on the door latch. He stared at her, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered, taking in the change. In Redemption, the atmosphere was even more hostile than before. Jedediah's poison had worked. The whispers were louder, the stares more pointed. Jedediah himself was holding court on the porch of the saloon, a small group of sycophants laughing at his crude jokes. He saw their wagon approach, and his face lit up with malicious glee. He sauntered toward them, blocking their path to the general store. "Come to return my property, Cole," he sneered, his eyes raking over Ilara. "Dressed her up pretty. Figured you owed me that much." Silas stepped down from the wagon, his body a rigid wall of fury. "Get out of my way, Vance." "Or what?" "You gonna hide behind her skirts?" Jedediah taunted. This was it. The moment of decision. Before Silas could react, before the situation could spiral into the brute violence Jedediah craved, Ilara moved. She slid down from the wagon seat, landing softly in the dust. She ignored the gasps from the onlookers and the stunned silence from Jedediah's cronies. She walked directly to Silas, who stood frozen, his focus entirely on his enemy. She reached up, put her hands on his shoulders, and pulled his face down to hers. His eyes widened in shock. For a tense, silent heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then, she kissed him. It was not a timid, gentle kiss. It was firm, deliberate, acclaiming. It was a seal on a pact, a declaration for all the world to see. She was not a prize to be fought over. She was a woman making a choice. She broke the kiss and looked not at him, but directly at Jedediah Vance, her eyes clear and defiant. Her voice, though not loud, carried with absolute clarity in the sudden, dead silence of the street. "I'm yours," she said. But the words were for Silas. They were not a surrender of self, but a pledge of allegiance. "My fight is with you. My loyalty is to you. We stand together." The two simple words redefined everything. She had taken Jedediah's narrative of property and possession and burned it to the ground with a single, irrefutable act of will. She saw the understanding dawn in Silas's pale eyes, followed by a wave of something so profound, so raw, it stole her breath. And she saw the sputtering, impotent rage on Jedediah's face. She had not been one. She had chosen. Jedediah's humiliation was a toxic fuel. He could not let it stand. 3 nights later, under the sliver of a cruel moon, they came. Ilara was woken not by a sound, but by a sudden change in the atmosphere, a primal sense of wrongness. The dog outside, usually a vigilant barker, was silent. A deadly silence. She slipped out of her cot and into the main room. Silas was already there, standing by the window, his rifle in his hands. He didn't need to speak. She knew. "How many?" she whispered, her voice steady. "3, he answered, his voice a low growl. "Vance and 2 others." The first gunshot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the door frame. The siege had begun. Panic, cold and familiar, tried to claw its way up her throat, but she shoved it down. She was not the same woman who had arrived here in terror. "The windows," she said, her mind racing. The back. While Silas took up a position covering the front door, she ran to the rear of the cabin, dragging the heavy oak table to barricade the smaller back door. She grabbed the spare axe from its place by the hearth. The handle was smooth and heavy in her hands. It was not a gun, but it was a weapon. She would not be a damsel cowering in a corner. This was her home, and she would defend it. Another shot rang out, this time shattering the glass of the front window. Silas fired back, the roar of the rifle deafening in the enclosed space. A yelp of pain from outside told him he'd found a mark. They heard Jedediah's enraged roar. "Burn them out!" The smell of smoke began to snake into the cabin. They had set fire to the small woodshed attached to the side of the house. Desperation gave her an idea. "The lamp oil," she hissed. Silas looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. He gave a curt nod. While he laid down suppressing fire, she worked quickly, pouring the contents of 2 lamps onto a pile of rags near the back window, the one furthest from the growing fire. "Silas," she called. He glanced back. She pointed to the oil-soaked rags, then to the hearth. He understood immediately. It was a desperate gamble. He fired 2 more rounds out the front, drawing their attention, then scrambled back as she lit a splinter of wood in the fire. "Now," he yelled. She tossed the flaming splinter onto the rags. They erupted in a whoosh of flame. From the outside, it would look as if the fire was spreading much faster than it was, consuming the entire rear of the cabin. They heard panicked shouts. The attackers, thinking their quarry was about to be engulfed in a fiery trap of their own making, broke cover. It was the mistake Silas had been waiting for. He moved to the now uncovered back window, using the glare of their diversionary fire to silhouette his targets. The rifle spoke twice more, 2 sharp, final pronouncements in the night. Then, an unnerving silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning woodshed. Cautiously, Silas peered out. "They're gone," he said, his voice ragged with exhaustion and adrenaline. One lay still in the dirt. Jedediah and the other were scrambling away into the darkness, one of them helping the other, who was clearly wounded. They would not be back. The fire in the woodshed was small, and they were able to beat it out with blankets and dirt, their movements synchronized and efficient in the pre-dawn gloom. When the last ember was extinguished, they stood in the wreckage, covered in soot and grime, the acrid smell of smoke clinging to them. The danger was over. The threat was gone. A profound, bone-deep weariness settled over Ilara. She looked at Silas. A long gash ran along his cheekbone, beading with blood. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched the wound. He flinched at the contact but stood his ground, his pale eyes fixed on her. The barriers were gone, burned away in the violence of the night. They were no longer owner and property, man and woman, but 2 survivors, bound together by the blood and smoke of a shared battle. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his calloused palm rough against her skin. He did not pull it away from his face. He simply held it there, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The silence that fell was not empty or strained. It was a silence of completion, of profound and weary understanding. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and they had faced it together. Inside the cabin, she gently washed the cut on his face with a damp cloth. He sat at the table, uncharacteristically still, allowing her to tend to him. His eyes never left her face, and in their depths, she saw the last of the haunted grief give way to a flicker of something new, something tentative and fragile, but undeniably present, hope. When she was done, she didn't move away. He did not move away. The space between them was no longer a chasm of loneliness, but a small, sacred ground they had earned together. The ordeal was over. A new, uncertain day was dawning, but they would face it, as they had faced the night, as one. As the sun rose, it cast a clean, golden light across the plains, washing away the shadows of the night. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Ilara stood on the small porch, a tin cup of coffee warming her hands. The land no longer looked like a prison. It looked like home. The vast, empty spaces that had once terrified her now seemed filled with a quiet promise. It was a hard land, a demanding land, but it was honest. It hid no malice in whispers or judgmental stares. Its challenges were wind and drought and stone, and they could be met with strength and persistence. Silas came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. He had mended the broken doorframe, his movements as economical and deliberate as always. But something in his posture had eased. The rigid, self-imposed isolation had softened at the edges. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the light spread across their domain. The cattle were grazing in the distance, the chickens were scratching in the dirt, and a single, determined pumpkin vine had begun to snake its way across the soil in her garden. These were the small, quiet signs of a life being built, of resilience taking root. This life was not one she had dreamed of. It had been born of shame and desperation, forged in hardship and violence. But it was real. And it was hers. She had come here as property, a ghost of a woman with nothing but a trunk full of worn clothes and a heart full of fear. She had learned to find her strength not in defiance or escape, but in the deliberate act of creation, of connection, of choosing her ground and the person she would stand it with. "The land is quiet this morning," Silas said, his voice low. It was a simple observation, but it held the weight of the night they had survived, and all the silent days before it. "Yes," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. It is she looked at him, at the weathered lines of his face, the pale eyes that no longer held the ghosts of the past, but a reflection of the wide-open sky before them. He was not a savior, and she was not a victim. They were two solitary people who had found in each other an unlikely sanctuary. She had not been one in a poker game. She had been found. And in finding him, in this harsh and beautiful place, she had finally found herself. The future would be difficult, but for the first time since she could remember, she was not afraid. She was home. And she was not alone.